Growing up within an Old Order Amish community in a rural pocket of Indiana, life was defined by specific, quiet expectations. As the third daughter born to a skilled carpenter and a mother whose exceptional apple butter was renowned across multiple counties, the concept of vocalizing personal exhaustion simply did not exist, as she never once uttered a complaint aloud during all my years beside her. Entering into matrimony at 21 and subsequently departing the community at 26, the years since have been defined by a continuous effort to articulate the nuanced experiences that unfolded during that window of time. This is a dedicated space where those suppressed realities are finally granted a voice. For anyone who has ever been made to feel that their internal distress was invalid, insufficient, or too invisible to warrant attention, this account is meant for you. If you value preserving narratives that were traditionally confined strictly within the domestic sphere, consider staying connected to this journey, and if you have ever experienced a moment where a person in a position of trust chose to disregard your quiet suffering, reflecting on that shared reality helps dismantle the isolation. My own encounter with that kind of dismissal began long before I ever crossed the threshold of the church leader's residence. To comprehend the decision to approach the church authority, it is necessary to grasp the precise nature of my domestic life prior to that day. My husband, Eli, was not a man characterized by overt aggression. He never elevated his voice, inflicted physical injuries, returned home under the influence, or directed hostility toward our offspring. Within the cultural framework of my youth, the absence of these specific vices was considered the exact definition of a virtuous spouse, and according to the moral ledger I had been trained to follow since infancy, he fulfilled the role perfectly. The reality, utilizing terminology I had not yet acquired, was that he exercised authority through an intentional manipulation of the domestic atmosphere. When my conduct met his approval, a sense of comfort permeated our household, characterized by evening conversations at the dinner table, engagement with our children, and the sharing of bedtime stories. Conversely, whenever I fell short of his unspoken standards, that emotional warmth vanished instantly, leaving the interior environment as starkly frigid as if the windows had been flung wide in the depths of winter. He abstained from conflict and offered no explanations, choosing instead to withdraw his presence entirely in a manner that remained completely imperceptible to the outside world. Consequently, the initial 3 years of our union were defined by a perpetual state of quiet apprehension as I constantly scrutinized my own behavior, attempting to restore harmony by striving to be more compliant, more soft-spoken, and inherently better. By the time I recognized that this emotional climate had nothing to do with my performance, but was rather a calculated methodology of behavioral control through the systematic granting and withholding of affection, I was already the mother of a 2-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son, inhabiting a physical frame that no longer understood how to experience peace without first laboring to earn it. The specific event that ultimately compelled me to seek counsel from the elder occurred on an unremarkable Wednesday late in autumn. While the full scope of that particular day is best reserved for its own dedicated reflection, it is important to understand that it did not represent the pinnacle of my distress. It was merely a minor incident, significant only in the way the final strand of a tensioned cable is significant, just before the entire structure snaps under weight. Without prior discussion or warning, Eli simply announced that my sister was permanently banned from entering our property. There was no dialogue or justification offered. He simply delivered the mandate in his characteristic manner, quietly, definitively, and with a tone that suggested the decree was an unalterable reality, and my awareness of it was a mere formality. My sister represented the solitary individual in my life who truly perceived my existence, who would sit opposite me and inquire about my well-being with genuine intent rather than empty politeness. Hearing her name coupled with an absolute prohibition caused something within me that had been compromising for 3 years to finally lock into place. Abstaining from outward protest or tears, I waited until he departed for his outdoor labor before sitting at the kitchen table to finalize my decision to approach the church leadership. I genuinely believed at the time that the ecclesiastical structure existed to safeguard vulnerable women. That principle had been instilled in me from childhood, that spiritual governance operated in a direct hierarchy from husband to bishop and ultimately to the divine, implying that if a spouse defaulted on his duties, the leadership served as a sanctuary where help could be obtained. I journeyed to his residence on a Thursday morning during the second week of November, navigating an atmosphere carrying that distinct, crisp chill that precedes the arrival of deep winter. Attired in my formal black outerwear and regular prayer cap, my hands were empty because I possessed nothing to offer except the testimony I intended to deliver. The physical trajectory of the walk was as meticulously plotted as the words themselves, as I repeatedly instructed myself to maintain absolute composure and clarity. I knew that if I succumbed to weeping, the leader would focus entirely on the emotional display rather than the systemic cause behind it, so I resolved to present the facts directly, operating under the assumption that his office naturally equipped him to resolve such matters. I had spent nearly 2 months mentally arranging this dialogue, lying awake beneath the dark ceiling of our bedroom while Eli slept with the absolute tranquility of a man unburdened by hidden thoughts. By the time I stood 37 paces from the elder's entrance, an involuntary tremor took hold of my frame, persisting until I was seated within his living quarters. He served coffee without inquiry, positioned himself opposite me, and allowed me to begin. I articulated the prolonged periods of absolute withdrawal, the banishment of my sibling, and the systematic use of emotional validation as a disciplinary restraint. I detailed the events of that November week, alongside the numerous antecedent patterns, describing the permanent anxiety that resided in my chest, as I constantly evaluated Eli's posture at evening meals to gauge the safety of the household. I shared how our young daughter had begun replicating this behavior, monitoring her father's countenance with the same vigilance one uses to scan the horizon for an approaching storm. Throughout this extensive disclosure, he remained entirely silent, offering no interruptions until I concluded. Following a brief pause, he delivered a perspective that I had not anticipated encountering. He explained that while the circumstances described indicated a difficult marriage, a challenging union did not equate to a broken covenant, noting that spiritual intervention is reserved for instances of actual harm, and my testimony failed to meet that specific criteria. He continued speaking with a measured tranquility and pastoral composure, utilizing the exact same vocal cadence he employed when delivering Sunday sermons to the congregation. He noted that the marital bond inherently demands mutual sacrifice, suggesting that periods of silence between spouses could represent the quiet movement of the Holy Spirit rather than an emotional injury. He asserted that a man who refrains from physical violence, provides material sustenance for his offspring, maintains regular worship attendance, and honors his religious obligations is fulfilling his sacred duties. He then looked at me while the mantel clock measured the seconds, and my hands remained pressed flat against my clothing, suggesting that the core of my distress might actually stem from a spiritual flaw of uncontentment, a matter he proposed we address through mutual prayer. The internal reaction to his assessment was devoid of immediate anger, as resentment was an emotion that would only surface much later in a completely different reality. Sitting within a counseling office where an objective professional would explicitly validate my experience as entirely unacceptable. In that moment, the sensation was much more profound. It felt as though an escape route I had trusted in since childhood had simply vanished from existence, leaving a solid wall where I had expected a door. He had established a rigid boundaries of recognition, purposefully leaving my reality on the exterior. Visible injuries, physical trauma, material abandonment, or public misconduct were recognized as violations, but the systematic deprivation of emotional security, the unilateral banishment of family members, and the intentional use of psychological isolation to induce compliance were categorized merely as the trials of a difficult union, a personal failure of contentment, or divine refinement. My physical form responded by nodding in apparent agreement, a reaction triggered automatically by an entire lifetime of training in compliance, operating entirely independent of my actual volition. I expressed formal gratitude, departed the residence, and stepped back into the autumn chill, pausing on the roadway for several moments before I could compel my feet to move toward my household. Standing in that space, an observation shared by an acquaintance named Lydia, years prior during a communal barn raising, came back to me with absolute clarity. She had remarked that our culture lacked any specific vocabulary for such experiences, resulting in it simply being labeled as the duty of a good wife. The complete depth of her insight, which had eluded me at the time, became entirely transparent on that road. Because the community possessed no terminology for this specific form of subjugation, the infraction itself was rendered non-existent within their framework. The leader had not executed a malicious dismissal. He had merely audited the situation using the only interpretive ledger available to him and found my reality entirely absent from its pages. I was attempting to describe an entirely unfamiliar phenomenon to someone who concluded in all sincerity that because it lacked a name, it did not exist. Upon returning home, I proceeded with the routine tasks of preparing sustenance and tending to the young ones, maintaining absolute silence toward Eli just as he maintained it toward me. For the first time in 3 years, however, the effort to actively alter the emotional temperature of the household ceased entirely. This shift was not an act of capitulation, but rather a fundamental restructuring of my internal alignment. The desire to survive within the confines of the established order was replaced by a quiet cessation of belief in the system itself. From that Thursday forward, my posture shifted from passive waiting to active observation, an entirely different state of awareness. To exist in a state of waiting is to remain invested in the idealized narrative the community maintains about itself, the belief that its structures are inherently protective, and that leadership doors exist to provide sanctuary. Active observation, conversely, positions an individual outside of that narrative, allowing them to perceive the actual mechanics functioning beneath the surface. I began to look at the other women in the community with new eyes, detecting subtle indicators that would remain invisible to the casual observer. It was visible in the specific alignment of their shoulders during communal gatherings, the inconspicuous manner in which they monitored their spouse's movements across a shared room, and the unique variety of exhaustion etched into their expressions at the conclusion of the Sabbath. This particular weariness was entirely divorced from physical labor, remaining completely untouched by rest. I had carried that exact exhaustion for years without recognizing its structural form, but now it was visible everywhere, a pervasive social condition that lacked any institutional acknowledgement. This reality became explicitly clear during a quilting gathering at a neighbor's home, where I closely observed the church leader's wife, Miriam. She was a senior matriarch who moved through environments with extreme discretion, minimizing her physical presence as if attempting to occupy no space whatsoever. While I had previously interpreted her demeanor as absolute serenity, watching her when her husband entered the room revealed a subtle, almost imperceptible hesitation in her labor, a momentary tracking of his position before she returned her focus to her needlework. It became clear that she inhabited the exact same reality, standing on the identical side of the structural barrier, having simply occupied that position for a duration long enough to forget that access to an exit was ever a possibility. Several months later, during a large community gathering, the elder approached me near the dining tables, offering a warm salutation and inquiring about the children and the progress of the farm fencing. As he smiled and continued on his way, a profound realization settled within me. He possessed absolutely no recollection of the specific interaction that had completely dismantled and rearranged my entire internal existence. The meeting I had prepared for over the course of 7 weeks, entering with every fragile remnant of my hope, constituted nothing more than an ordinary Tuesday in his routine. I was simply one of many individuals who sought counsel, received his standardized advice, and was dismissed home, allowing his day to proceed uninterrupted over a cup of coffee. The immense weight of his edict was a burden reserved exclusively for those who carried it back to their households. He had relinquished it the moment the door closed behind us. My departure from the community occurred 14 months after that pivotal autumn meeting, an extensive transition that warrants its own dedicated reflection. In the subsequent years, an objective professional provided the necessary vocabulary to illuminate those past experiences, offering clarity, much like delivering a lamp to someone confined in darkness. Concepts like coercive control and institutional minimization were introduced, the intentional design of institutional frameworks that position non-physical injury entirely outside the realm of accountability, and the condition of consenting to governance by a structure that has engineered immunity directly into its foundations. Receiving this vocabulary felt precisely like being informed, after a lifetime of having a deep injury dismissed as a superficial scratch, that the damage had actually been a structural fracture the entire time. The sensation was not one of validation or triumph, but rather the quiet devastation of recognizing that the diagnostic instruments I had been handed since youth were fundamentally flawed. Within the vocabulary of my upbringing, those modern terms were completely non-existent, replaced entirely by the classifications the leader had articulated on that November morning. Injuries must leave physical evidence or cross an arbitrary threshold established to preserve the continuity of the institution. Everything falling below that line was minimized as a standard domestic trial, a personal deficiency in contentment, or spiritual refinement. Consequently, the women existing beneath that threshold were routinely directed back to their environments to increase their devotion, analyze their internal motivations, and verify their absolute compliance, framing the systemic entrapment as a personal failure of execution. It is crucial to analyze this dynamic objectively, as the church leader was far from a malicious individual. He was simply a product of a cultural framework he had never been given any reason to evaluate critically. That framework dictated that human suffering possessed a specific hierarchy, asserting that only particular categories of distress qualified for an institutional response, and he administered that ledger with absolute fidelity. He displayed no overt cruelty toward the individuals who approached his residence with visible trepidation and rehearsed appeals. He treated them with gentleness, dismissing them with spiritual counsel and the absolute conviction that he had executed his duties correctly. The malice did not reside within his character, but within the cultural apparatus that equipped him with a defective diagnostic tool and proclaimed it absolute truth. For anyone who developed within an environment that demanded internal distress achieve a specific magnitude before it was deemed valid, or who sat before an authority figure as they consulted an unwritten checklist and determined your suffering fell below the line of recognition, that experience is real and understood. If you ever found yourself offering formal compliance and gratitude to the very structure that minimized your reality, that reaction was not an indicator of weakness, but a mechanism of survival within an apparatus engineered over generations to ensure your injuries remained minor enough to disregard, preventing the institution from ever having to answer for them. The leadership maintained that the distress was insufficient, but the reality is that the suffering was always significant enough to matter. The institutional threshold was never an accurate gauge of human pain. It was merely a metric of what the community was willing to acknowledge, and those two concepts are fundamentally distinct. The inability of an external structure to accurately evaluate your internal reality does not diminish its magnitude. It merely exposes the definitive limitations of the instrument they are using.